Hi, welcome to another session on the Rewiring Your Brain World Summit. My name is Fleet Mall, your co-host for this session, and I'm really happy to be here with Sharon Salzberg. How are you, Sharon?
I'm well, thank you.
Oh, it's great to do this with you, and I'm so happy you could be part of our summit, so thank you very much for that. I'm going to share your bio with folks, and then we'll get started, okay?
Sure, great.
All right. Sharon Salzberg is a meditation pioneer, world-renowned teacher, and New York Times bestselling author. She is one of the first to bring mindfulness and loving kindness meditation to mainstream American culture over 45 years ago, inspiring generations of meditation teachers and wellness influencers. Sharon is a co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, and the author of 12 books, including New York Times bestseller Real Happiness, now in its second edition, and her seminal work, Loving Kindness. Her 2023 release, Real Life, The Journey from Isolation to Openness and Freedom, is now available from Flatiron Books in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook formats. Her podcast, The Meta Hour, has amassed 6 million downloads and features interviews with thought leaders from the mindfulness movement and beyond. And you can find all about Sharon's work at sharonsalzberg.com. So, Sharon, with your background as a longtime dedicated practitioner of meditation, mindfulness, the contemplative life, and a world-renowned mindfulness and meta teacher, this must give you some insights into the human mind and human behavior. So what have you learned along the way about how, some of the dynamics of our mind and how meditation and mindfulness can influence that?
Well, I should say, first of all, that when you say metta, you mean METTA, right? Which is
That's
loving
right.
kindness.
Yeah, metta, the loving kindness practice, right?
Yeah. Well, I went to India when I was 18 years old. So my whole formulation as an adult and understanding the mind and emotion and my emotional landscape was all based on the meditative experience. I was doing meditation before I ever went to therapy, for example, or practiced much introspection in other ways. And it wasn't only the meditation, it was also really the kind of approach of the Buddhist perspective, which I consider a psychology more than a philosophy or a religion. And from that perspective, it's quite interesting, that consciousness, for example, is considered to be pure knowing, like we know a sight, we know a sound, we know a thought, something like that. And then there are all these little filters, these mind states that affect how we know. Do we know with hatred? Do we know with love? Do we hear a sound with regret? Do we hear a sound with delight? And so that just became the map for paying attention from within and beginning to understand, oh, it's different. And the consequence of that was really a kind of confidence in understanding the world and myself that was different from maybe the stories I'd been told, like vengefulness is strong, like never give up a grudge or something like that. But when you actually look at your experience, what you feel in your body, what's happening in the emotional landscape, as you hold on to that grudge, isn't that so strong? It's pretty brittle, it's pretty breakable. Or many of us have been taught things like compassion, loving kindness, generosity, gratitude. They're kind of stupid, they're sentimental and they make you weak and be full of regrets about giving too much away or whatever. But when you really look at your experience directly, you think, no, that's a whole other source of strength I could be tapping. And so it's this amazing adventure.
So one of the well-known quotes from the Buddha is, the mind is the forerunner of all things. And from what you're talking about, I mean, we could say, well, that's thoughts. Although thoughts come and go, they're pretty ephemeral. But when they become mind states, that really does start to influence how we're perceiving the world and how we show up in the world. So is that kind of what that's referring to, those mind states that begin to really filter our experience and then really determine who we're being?
Well, it's like having a strong habit, and so it's kind of fascinating to notice, and I think it fits in well with many schools of Western psychology. So, for example, from within that framework, one might have a strong tendency toward what they would call delusion, which in that context means being kind of spaced out, maybe going numb, not letting yourself feel too much, or being a little vague about things, which is very much my type, more than any of the other types that they describe. And so one of the consequences of that, one of the problems with that, is that you're then reliant on someone else's vision of what's happening, what's real, in order to kind of get awake. And so I have many stories and many experiences of me doing just that. And yet, that was probably taken up by me in a very wise way in some really challenging circumstance of my life. I know it was. And it was a smart thing to do for a little while when I had no other options, perhaps, or none that I could see. And that doesn't mean I want it to be my go-to place forever. But what we're invited to is not to disdain those habits or mind states or be judgmental or harsh about them, but to develop a different relationship to them so that we can recognize them, realize we do have options, and in many circumstances, perhaps reach for one of those options.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that I think Buddhism and the teachings we have is much more of a psychology than a religion or a philosophy even. And it's amazing what a thorough, well worked out psychology and mapping of consciousness and mapping of mind and mind states was developed, 2,500 years ago, or even if it developed and elaborated over the next 500 years or so, still a long time ago. And I don't even think in the height of Greco-Roman culture, they had beautiful philosophy, obviously Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, but they weren't really developing a psychology of the same kind. And it wasn't as well thoroughly mapped out in terms of how the mind really works. And we didn't begin to see that in the West until the 20th century, really. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty amazing that such a thorough mapping out of the mind goes back that far. And so, humans have, in terms of practices like mindfulness meditation, other contemplative practices, the love and kindness practice, and so forth, humans have known for millennia that these practices are incredibly effective, that they have lasting benefits, that they can lead to really profound states of liberation and so on. And so we don't really need Western science to confirm that or affirm that. At the same time, it is kind of interesting that Western science and neuroscience in particular is confirming and affirming a lot of what these traditions have been telling us about these practices for several thousand years. And, I'm wondering whether maybe, and we have colleagues who are Buddhist practitioners or at least mindfulness practitioners who are doing some of this research, people like Richie Davidson, Judd Brewer, Misa Jha, and others, many, many, many researchers. And there's literally thousands of scientific studies have been done on mindfulness. And I'm wondering whether, at the very least, this can maybe refine some of our understanding of these practices and their impacts, or even maybe help us adjust and refine some of our teaching methodologies. At the very least, it's opening a lot of minds to these practices because they see the sciences there. So I'm just curious about your thoughts about what we've seen in the last couple of decades of all this research on these practices and how that's impacting this realm of meditation, contemplative spirituality, and so forth.
Well, at the very, very least, as you say, it's a tremendous benefit. I think of those researchers, people like John Kabat-Zinn, who formulated mindfulness-based stress reduction, as almost like the early translators of old, who brought the teachings from India to Tibet, for example. And the Buddha's recommendation was always teach in the local idiom. So what is our idiom? And I, like many people of a certain age, I remember the day when, you'd say mindfulness and nobody would know what you're talking about or have not the vaguest idea or think you were weird. Or when I first came back from India in 1974, and I would be introduced or introduce myself at a party or some social situation as a meditation teacher, people would often kind of like, ooh, that's weird, Or occasionally somebody would say to me, did you meet the Beatles over there? I'd say, no, sadly, they went when I was in high school. and different lineage anyway. But and nowadays, I think largely because of the research, it's a whole other world in terms of people being curious and at least thinking about maybe approaching it and seeing for themselves, if it's of any benefit. It's been a whole revolution, which I really lay on that ability to explore scientifically. I think there are a lot of questions, in terms of one's goal. And also, I think it's incumbent upon everyone, both contemplatives and scientists, to understand we can learn a lot from a lot of sources. So in terms of the learning, I was reminding Richie just the other day, we were on a Zoom panel together of many panels we had been on where I've had a perennial question, which was, let's say you have a great meditation master who is renowned worldwide for their tremendous loving kindness and compassion, and you pop them into an fMRI machine and ask them to do a compassion meditation, and the wrong part of their brain lights up. Do you then say, maybe our instrumentation is not refined enough? This is just a beginning baby pioneering science. Maybe we have a long way to go. Or do you say, guy has an undeserved reputation? And every time, because we did this a lot, Richie would say, science must always be humble. Mm-hmm. And I reminded him of that like 20 years later, just the other day. And I think it's true for all of us. We need that kind of humility to feel, I don't look to science to authenticate, as you say, meditation and even the methodology. In addition to its sort of outreach potential and realization, I think of it often in terms of, the stumbling blocks people have, for example, say having a daily meditation practice, which is not that easy. And I think about the science of habit formation and how some really exciting young Tibetan teachers are trying to understand that so they can help people have an easier time developing the habit of meditation along with the other habits that we might have. That's very exciting to me. But we all need to understand that goals can be different as well. I was once on a stage with another researcher, Barbara Fredrickson, who does a lot of research into loving kindness meditation. And Barbara has since changed her mind about what I'm about to describe. But at the time, she was saying that, when you do loving kindness meditation in the classical way, you're offering phrases of loving kindness and support to various categories of being, starting with yourself. So you may be silently repeating things like, may I be safe, be happy, not as like beseeching, but as gift giving or offering. And so you move from yourself to somebody you really care about on through various categories till we come to all beings everywhere. So Barbara was saying that she felt it was important for somebody to have some kind of positive experience in doing the practice within a couple of weeks, or they may be too discouraged to continue. And that was difficult because so many people have difficulty offering loving kindness to themselves. And I said to her up on the stage, I said, why don't you change the order? Like have them start with somebody that's easier. Your puppy, your child, whatever it is. And she said, I can't do that because I'm interested in the research where it has to be totally replicable. Everyone has to be doing the same thing in the same sequence. And I said, I would change the sequence in a second with like a living, breathing human being in mind, who just needs a kind of alteration because there are underlying principles to this, which in that practice include doing it the easiest way possible. It's not a practice that we benefit from struggle in any way. And Barbara has changed her mind since then, but I just sat there thinking, we have different goals, actually. Mm-hmm. And we may approach things very differently.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I've been involved in in research over the years with our prison work, our mindfulness-based prison programs. And I tend to really synthesize a lot of things, and you're building a whole program. You're bringing a lot of different things that are effective, can be impactful. And, you don't know what that tipping point is for any one individuals. But researchers, they want to identify that one thing in there. That's the thing that's making the difference. Forget about the rest of that. We're only going to pay for you to do this one little thing here because that's the active ingredient, which is, so there are different goals, driving research often. And I agree with you that the science on habit change, I think, is one place that's really worth looking into in terms of helping people develop a practice. And I've also found the science on embodiment and interoceptive awareness, greater awareness of the internal landscape of the body, to be really helpful in terms of how I teach mindfulness and helping people have more of an experience earlier on that's going to help them keep going. So I think there are some things there. This summit is all about exploring various approaches and methodologies for rewiring the brain. That's the name of the summit. For healing trauma, healing attachment wounds, as well as for optimizing overall health and well-being, life performance, happiness, longevity, and so forth. And so I know that you teach mindfulness and meditation, loving kindness practice, so more in the context of the Dharma than in neuroscience, as we've been discussing. And but I wonder if you could talk about what you've seen. Maybe we'll start with mindfulness, and then we'll circle back to loving kindness. What you've seen in terms of some of the lasting impacts for yourself and others over time with consistent mindfulness practice. Because if you do see lasting effects that become stable, then one could assume, based on current science, that there is some rewiring of the brain going on from what we now know about the brain. So I'm wondering, what do you see in terms of lasting impacts that become, sort of sustainable?
Well, one thing I feel I've clearly seen both in myself and so many students at this point is it's almost like a change in the holding environment, or the internal environment within which various things come and go. It's sort of like externally, it reminds me of this story of this woman, Kate Baystrup, who's a chaplain and works for the Forestry Service in Maine. And she was sent out on a call to be with this family where their young child had wandered off in the woods and was later found safely, and unharmed, but they didn't know that at the time. And so she's sitting with the parents, and the mom says something to her like, "How kind of the Forestry Service to send you to us to keep me from freaking out." And Kate said, "Oh, in contrast, I'm here to be with you while you freak out. Instead of avoiding a challenging feeling." Mm-hmm. And what a circumstance, of course, you'd have that. It's the surround, it's the atmosphere, it's the way it's met. That's the kind of the whole point. And so over time, what we see with practicing mindfulness is that some of the same thoughts or patterns or emotions may arise, or you may have like a chronic physical pain condition. So the sort of manifestation of what's happening could be the same, but it's met in a completely different way. So how do we ordinarily meet a challenging feeling, either physical or emotional or whatever? With shame, with bitterness, perhaps, with blame, with a sense of kind of fatality, like this is all I will ever feel for the rest of my life, or this is going to become this and this and this and this, with kind of projection, and learning not to do all of those, what we call add-ons, but to be with the experience more as it is in a kinder way with more balance, gives us a sense of space and perspective. And within that, we may see many different options for taking action or seeking change or something like that. But it's not that the very thing, the fear, the whatever it might be, is never going to appear again, but we will have a totally different experience. And so my favorite example of that is probably my friend, Sylvia Borstein, who describes herself as a recovering catastrophizer. Mm. She says she's 86 now, and She says, I'm the kind of person who I'll call one of my adult children and they don't answer the phone. So the worst must have happened. And sometimes the worst does happen, of course, but not every single time. And she said, it never occurs to me they might be taking a shower or they fell in love. They don't feel like talking to their mother. And so rather than like checking it out, she'll just start spinning. So that's why she got into meditation practice, was because she was haunted by that sort of anticipatory, unreal anxiety. And so I think she still has some of the same thoughts, but she's totally different with them. So she said to me the other day, she said, I have a new mantra. So I said, what is it? And she said, not every bus ends up in a ditch. And so we can greet our even deepest habits and the things that haunt us the most differently. And then we have a lot of space.
So it sounds like the practice over time gives us, changes our relationship with our own mind and gives us a way to work with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that feels stable. It's not so circumstantial. So.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about metta or loving kindness practice. So can with consistent practice of loving kindness, can we actually really become more loving, more compassionate, more altruistic in a sustained way, not just as we're doing the practice, but really over time, that it actually changes how we are in the world, that we actually are more loving, we are more generous, altruistic, compassionate, and so forth?
I think we are. And in fact, one of the challenges with doing that kind of practice is that the results show up much more in our lives than it does in, say, Mishi Jha would say 12 minutes a day that you practice, but I'll say 20, much more than that little period when you're sitting on a cushion or you're dedicating your time specifically to the practice. I once had a friend who'd been doing loving kindness practice for about 3 years take me out to lunch in New York, and he said, this is going to be like a confessional lunch. So I said, oh, what'd you do? And he said, well, I've been doing loving kindness practice for about 3 years now. And whether I'm on retreat or I'm just sitting at home, that's my practice. And I can't say that my experience 3 years later is all that different when I'm meditating than it was in the beginning. But he said, I'm like a totally different person. He said, I'm different with myself. Like when I make a mistake, I'm different with my family. I'm different with my community. I'm different ethically. And then he looked at me and he said, is that enough? And I said, yeah, I kind of think it's enough. But we tend to look at that very specific little period, like, am I flying it or whatever it is that we want? And it may not be there, but we find, and I also don't think loving kindness is necessarily emotional, which is another trap. It could be like that moment when you realize, I haven't been listening to this person at all. Let me really be here. And you open and you're surprised by them, in some way. You've been holding on to some rigid idea of who they were, and it's not necessarily who they are. Or you realize, I'm kind of impatient. I want this person to finish talking to me in the elevator. I'm in New York, so that's never done. But, and you realize maybe they have no one else to talk to. And you just kind of relax and you're there, but it doesn't mean the person's going to be your best friend, or you feel these huge waves of the emotion we call love, but you feel connection. And out of that connection comes a kind of caring, like maybe happy. We get curious about somebody rather than withdraw and just find them an annoyance, or especially, I think, they're all the many, many beings we just look through out of habit. We don't look at. We just count. We dehumanize. They play some function in our lives. That's who they are. And when we realize that and we just generate a little loving kindness, and it's like, oh, wow. People tell me, and I think it's true, that Zoom is a perfect vehicle for that, because you get all these little boxes and you can just look at people and silently think, may you be happy, and you too, and you as well, be happy, be peaceful, and then see what happens.
That might be an antidote to Zoom exhaustion.
Yeah.
Good thing to
Yeah.
try. Yeah, and our colleague Richie Davidson, some of his research has pointed to that some of these qualities that are being cultivated in both mindfulness and loving kindness practice, insight, presence, mindfulness, altruism, generosity, and so forth, are actually, they've identified that these are contributors to a felt sense of well-being. And they've actually identified neural substrates so that if you practice these things, you're going to develop these qualities and your overall sense of well-being is going to increase over time.
So Richie, I think he's wanted to do research too. I don't know how you design it on not only the effect within yourself, which I think can be experienced very directly and powerfully, but kind of your effect on the environment around you. Do people relax more around you? They feel less threatened, or less they have to prove themselves, they're more accepted. It would be an interesting experiment.
Absolutely, it would. There seems to be maybe not always linear, but certainly some relationship between who we're being and what shows up in our lives. So your new book, Real Life, The Journey from Isolation to Openness and Freedom, you speak about the contracted states that we find ourselves in. And I wonder if you could talk about that. That's kind of the opposite about what we were just talking about: openness, generosity, altruism, compassion, love, and kindness. So we often find ourselves contracting. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, and I've had interesting conversations with Judd, for example, Judd Brewer, who uses those same words of contraction and expansion to talk about different states. Well, I think classically, there's certain states, not when we feel them or even perhaps feel them intensely, but when we become overcome by them, right? When we really start drowning in them, that just shut us down. Grasping, feeling I don't have enough, I am not enough. That leads to a kind of addictive tendency, right? Fear. Intense anger. It's not that it's bad or wrong. I'm not saying we should judge ourselves or condemn ourselves, but just look at its nature. And again, it's not feeling it or even feeling it intensely, but when we're lost in it. So if you think about the last time you were really angry at yourself, really, really angry at yourself, and let's just bring it up for a moment. It's not a time where you're also thinking, you know what? I did 5 great things the same morning. Those 5 great things, they are gone. Right? We're kind of locked down in some way. I am bad. I am wrong. I am terrible. And so what would it be like to admit a mistake? Look at making amends or lessons learned. Using the energy of the distress to seek change, but not sort of spinning out and all of that burning and condemnation and shut down. I'm always this way. I'll always be this way. Right. And so that's really the path. It's saying, yeah, there's so many states where when we are lost in them, and delusion is another one, my favorite, where it's just like this sort of chronic sense of let's just take a nap and deal with it later, maybe, And so we discover for ourselves what our own habits may be, and really finding that fine line. You don't want to be judging what you're discovering, but instead realizing that if I'm lost in this state, it's like I stop breathing. Talk about embodiment. I don't see options. I'm stuck. I'm trapped. And that is different than being determined and one-pointed, and all of which could be great. It's very much that feeling of being trapped. And we can look, when do I feel most trapped?
Mm-hmm. Well, when someone finds themselves really stuck, and they've really been kind of hijacked by strong mind states or emotions, and or even just thought patterns that are really And we know that trauma can do this as well, that it kind of locks us into a fight or flight or shut down kind of situation. What practices have you found most helpful in terms of helping somebody kind of release that and begin to reopen again?
Well, I think it's both sides of things, like another traumatic response that we hardly ever hear about is tend and befriend,
Mm-hmm.
where we're not necessarily in fight, flight, freeze, or faint. They keep extending that modality. But there's a sense of joining with others, not being so isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Attend and befriend. Like when I was in New York City in March 2020, I'd just gotten here after traveling, and anxiety was really building and illness was really growing, and it was really a hard time here. And I was teaching, and somebody it was a situation where the speaker would sit in the audience until they were formally introduced, then you get up on the stage. So I was still sitting in the audience, and someone was sitting next to me, and high anxiety, really suffering. So I began offering some possibilities, all of which can be useful, by the way. One of which I'm sure people have talked about, is having your out breath be longer than your in breath,
Mm-hmm.
so that the parasympathetic nervous system will take over from the sympathetic nervous system, and your whole being will start to kind of chill more. So she wasn't interested in that. And so then I said, well, loving kindness practice is a significant kind of healing agent in times like that. And she wasn't interested in that either. So I just looked at her and I said, is there anyone you can help? She lit up. And she said, yeah, I have like this elderly neighbor, and maybe I could slip a note under her door and offer to get her groceries or something like that. And I thought, oh, look at that. That's very interesting. So there are many practices. If we practice a kind of mindfulness, and there are many ways of describing it, which means not trying to undo let's say, the fear that's come up, but surround it in a certain way with presence, with balance, with kindness, then we will discover many things. And we won't be driven by the fear into maybe reckless behavior or shutting down what could be really good possibility for us. So there are lots of ways of describing that. Mindfulness, one way we do it is using the acronym RAIN, R-A-I-N. Recognize what's happening with fear, acknowledge it, like feel it in your body, investigate it. Like these emotions tend to be very complex. Like what else is cooking, regret, putting yourself down, just watch the fear movie in a way. And then non-identification or nurturing, like be kind to yourself anyway, even though what's going on is difficult. And then things will shift. They will just change all on their own very strongly too. One of my Tibetan teachers, Sunny Rinpoche, he has this practice he calls handshake practice, which is really kind of the same thing. Like he calls those states our beautiful monsters. And he said, approach it, shake its hand. Like it's everything really we've been saying. Like your awareness is stronger actually than this state. The state is just visiting. It may be really intense. You may visit a lot, but it's still just visiting. You can be there, and as you know, like a very vast oversimplification of another Tibetan practice would be invite the fear into dinner. Don't let it have the run of the house because that's dangerous, but you don't have to be so freaked out. You don't have to be so ashamed of what you're feeling. You are stronger. Your awareness, your essential qualities are stronger than the fear. And so I used that example once when I'm teaching, and somebody in the room didn't like it. So I said, okay, how about inviting like your beautiful monsters, your demon, in for a cup of tea? And they didn't like that either. So I said, okay, how about a cup of tea to go? And they said, that's okay. So there's some measure of, okay, we're here together. that we can do.
That's great. That's great. There's a famous story from the Tibetan yogi Saint Milarepa, where these demons moved into his cave, and he tried every strategy in the book to get rid of them. And he was a great adept. He had powers. He couldn't get rid of them. And then it dawned on him to make friends with them and serve them some tea, and they finally left.
Yeah.
So when we do find ourselves stuck in this contracted state, by that time we've already been kind of hijacked in a sense. I'm wondering, it seems like we're almost always moving back and forth in this kind of spectrum from openness to contraction. And I'm wondering, with regular, consistent mindfulness practice, that we might be aware of that at a more subtle level. So we start to pick up, even when we just begin to start to contract, we just begin to experience a little fear or anxiety or something. And maybe having that kind of mindfulness, being curious about that, like being able to label it, being curious about, oh, I find myself opening, or, oh, I'm starting, that actually that awareness might make us a little less likely to be hijacked.
I think that's absolutely true. It's often a question of timing, because by the time we might notice what's going on, it's already been amplified by, this is never going to change. I'm the only one who ever feels this, all these other things that happen. I will say also, I think that's the foundation. It's the absolute foundation of all the work that then follows. But if we can do it, and it takes kind of understanding that you're not being hypocritical, you're not trying to force anything or coerce anything. We also can stretch sometimes, like loving kindness is a practice of stretching for many of us. It's not our first instinct. Someone's like talking to us in the elevator and annoying us. But if you have a kind of curiosity about it, and again, nothing coercive, then you might, well, let's just say this example. If you have the habit of assessing yourself at the end of the day, like, how did I do today? And let's say you have the habit of pretty well only remembering the mistakes you made and what you did wrong and what you could have said better and how you didn't show up in that place, let's just say. So much so that you think about that comment you made during the meeting, and it's like your whole sense of who you are and all that you'll ever be just collapses into that stupid comment. It's almost like asking yourself, anything else happened today? Like anything good, any good within me? Or absent that, like wishing yourself well. May I be safe, and may I be happy, and seeing what happens from that. So it's not moving from a true place, like all that condemnation, to a phony place, or it shouldn't be. It's moving from a true place to another true place that tends to get very little airtime. So we kind of consciously stretch, like, what do I have to be grateful for? Anything? Just to see what that terrain is like, where all those people we encounter, like in the supermarket or all those places, and we don't really look at them. Consciously look at them or make a resolve. I'm going to thank 3 people today for some little service. And so you kind of put yourself in a situation where you're just experimenting. Like, what's it like when I do this? And it brings a tremendous kind of balance.
Yeah, and so many of us suffer from fairly negative internal environment. Like, we're really hard on ourselves, constant self-criticism, and it doesn't make a lot of sense if you reflect on it. Like, who's going to be our best friend if not us? I mean, we are our closest companion for this lifetime. But, there's a lot of things behind that, the psychology of the negativity bias and all kinds of evolutionary biological things that kind of set us up to be that way. Fortunately, it doesn't have to stay that way. It sounds like your friend that invited you out for the confessional lunch, who'd been doing a loving kindness practice consistently, wasn't really having any big experiences during the practice, but he did notice that his internal environment, his relationship with himself, had become somewhat kinder or friendlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And his relationship with others, his family, his community and so on, very much a change.
Yeah. So, in terms of our, how we function in life and, being able to perform well in life and, have relatively not happy all the time, but relatively happy, fulfilling lives and be successful in relationship and, the dealing with the challenges of our lives. It seems to be helpful to have a fairly flexible and adaptive mind, like psychological flexibility and being able to roll with things and be creative. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about how some of these practices can increase that kind of flexibility, our willingness to kind of pivot and change and see things differently and kind of roll with the things. Because especially in these times, it seems like maybe it's always been this way, but we seem to be in very uncertain times these days. And so it would seem to be really helpful the more of that kind of flexibility and adaptivity we could have.
Well, for me, in some funny way, it comes back to one of the first things I ever learned in meditation practice, which was a real shift in perspective. So the first instruction I ever got, I'd gone off to India to learn how to meditate. And after a few months, entered this intensive 10-day retreat led by S.N. Goenka. And the very first instruction he ever gave was sit down and feel your breath. Just feel the sensations of your in and out breath. And my first response, which I've often talked about, was, that's really stupid, like, where's the magical, esoteric, fantastic technique that's going to change my whole life? I came all the way to India. And then I thought, how hard can this be? What'll it be, like 800 breaths, 900 breaths before my mind starts to wander? And to my absolute shock, it was like one breath. Or maybe half a breath, and I'd be gone, and I'd be way gone. And I kept hearing, but I never believed in the beginning, that the really important moment was after I was gone. I'd been lost, or I'd fallen asleep, or I'd gone to La La Land for a while. And then came a moment where I realized, it's been quite some time since I last felt a breath. So in the beginning, that was the invitation to jump on the train of self-judgment and just tear into myself forever. But what I kept hearing was practice letting go gently and starting over. You can start over, right? Nothing's been ruined, nothing's been lost. You can begin again. And so I slowly began practicing in that way. And I realized, that is the root of resilience. And how many times a day in ordinary life do I actually have to do a course correction? Or I've made a mistake and I have to start over, or I've fallen down in some way and I have to either pick myself up or let others help me up, start over. And like, we're always beginning again. And so rather than holding on rigidly to anything, that became what Sonny Rinpoche called exercising the letting go muscle, right? It's just doing it again and again and again and again, actually in a way that wasn't about giving myself a lecture, it's time to let go or anything like that. It became like this almost muscle pattern, like, okay, I've been having a conversation. I haven't listened to a word you said. I realized that. Let go of all those thinking about email stuff. I'm back. I'm back fully and completely. And realizing I might have to do that 50 billion times. That's not a sign of failure. That's actually a skill to be able to let go and start over. And for me, it actually comes back to that lesson one, again and again, because, we tend to think of a path as very linear, like lesson 1 or 101, done with that, I've moved on, but we're always kind of cycling back.
Yeah, wow, that ability to just always recognize that there's always a fresh start. In every moment, we can make a fresh start. Really simplifies things and could open things up so much for us. And it's sometimes hard to get there. We just feel the weight of what we think is going to happen, what we thought just had happened, all our thoughts and opinions about that, and our identity around all that. And to be able to just stop and go, okay, a new beginning. Wow, very powerful. So it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about, in a way, you began in that Goenka retreat and, working with your breath and so forth. That we're really talking about training the mind. And, based on current neuroscience, we could assume that we're also rewiring the brain or reshaping our neural architecture in the process of that. But there is some ability to actually train the mind I mean, we learn. We're training the mind, and we learn. We develop new capabilities of working with our mind from these practices.
Yeah, well, I'm also old enough so that, when I was studying science in high school or something, there was no notion of neuroplasticity. Like after the age of 25 or something like that, unless you had a dire circumstance and it was only downhill, that it wasn't a question of development or evolution in a positive sense. And that's totally turned around. And I think, when one is emphasizing rewiring the brain, what we're really saying is this is a question of real embodiment. It's not a question of giving yourself a lecture or forcing yourself. Some circumstance, like I don't really feel like listening, but things shift, things change, our values change, our priorities change, our sense of comfort and discomfort changes. It starts to feel less and less comfortable to be in a tirade, for example. It doesn't feel powerful at all. It doesn't feel uncomfortable the way we once feared to be generous, and so we learn. And I think sometimes the hardest part of it all is taking that step toward trying to make it real, to trying to practice something, whatever it is. Because it's like baby steps and we fall down and we have to start over, and that's not that comfortable. Or maybe we think it's not for me, it's for everybody else. But to sort of claim the possibility for oneself seems to me to be, often quite difficult and just essential.
So some in our audience they don't currently have a classic mindfulness meditation practice or loving kindness practice, and they they're very interested in this idea of being able to train the mind and rewire the brain and for improving their life outcomes, their health and well-being, and so forth. What might be a good way to get started? I mean, I know your books have practices within them, and there's so much out there today. But how might somebody get started?
I mean, there are so many ways. I think there are books, there are apps. I think one thing. I mean, many of the scientists who are part of this community will say, Richie or Amishi, that in their labs they have found that you don't have to be formally meditating 18 hours a day to get some result. Amishi will say 12 minutes, and because we're all friends, often in some kind of discussion and often teasing, and I say, well, I don't know if you go for the bare minimum, like every time, or gee, that's very American. Like, what's the least amount of time I can put into this thing and get what I want? But it's not long. I mean, it's the regularity of it that seems most important. And from my point of view, an important component not only is self-knowledge, which I'll get into in a minute, but understanding something about what the goal is, because so many people will think that the goal is to wipe out all thinking or to have a perfectly blank mind, and it's not going to happen. And then they feel bad and they feel they failed. And but remember, we're not trying to destroy any experience, but create a different holding environment that can be with the joys and the sorrows in a different way, and everything in between. So some kind of understanding, I think, is really important, whether you do that through reading or conversation with friends or a teacher or a class or an app, however it comes, just to remind yourself, okay, whatever I experience is really okay. And then self-knowledge, I think, is helpful. Like one of the things that Mishi has said to me is, I think they found 12 minutes a day, 3 to 5 times a week is a good protocol. And I said, for me, 3 to 5 times a week won't work, because for me, it'll be Monday and I'll think, I'll start on Wednesday. It'll be Wednesday, I'll think, I'll do it 3 times on Saturday and be done. I never do it. But every day is every day. And so kind of evolving what feels right to you as a short-term challenge. Not, I'm going to do this every day for the rest of my life, but every day or 3 to 5 times a week, if that works for you, for 2 weeks or for a month. It's very finite, and you do it. And then you check it out. Do I want to do it again? Do I want to do something different? And when you are assessing, remember, my friend, don't look so much at that 12 minutes a day or whatever. Look at your life. How was I meeting a stranger? How was I giving a talk, the thing I've always been afraid of? Public speaking. How was I? What was my experience doing this or doing that? And that's how we know.
How about the importance of, you've been very involved in the development of a renowned meditation community in Barre, Massachusetts, that started way back in the 70s. And so just the importance of community, because, if you have a local center you can go to somewhere, a yoga center, a mindfulness center, some kind of place where meditation done, you might go there regularly because you enjoy seeing the people and you have a cup of tea and you have a good time. And you also get your 12 minutes or your 15 minutes or your half hour of meditation in. And also we know, even from current neuroscience and what Dan Siegel is calling interpersonal neurobiology, that part of that brain rewiring and the beneficial impacts is also happening in the relational field, not just inside the skull encapsulated brain. So I wonder if you could talk about the importance of community and being able to leverage community to support us in developing a practice.
Well, it is very important. I think, not everybody is going to be able to do that, for example. And I certainly learned that during the pandemic, where I read those chats, and so many people are in a caregiving, for example, that's their role in the family, and they can't go off to even that community center, although I wish they could. And we can develop that sense of community in many ways, but we have such a tendency toward a kind of isolation, like I'm the only one who feels this, I'm the only one. And it's never true. We're never all alone, however alone we might genuinely feel. And so being able to share experience, to be heartened by the fact that someone else was falling asleep meditating, or got afraid that their service could never be enough, or whatever it is, it's very encouraging to be able to share and be with people in those ways. And so even if it's online, even if it's in your head, because you're reading other people's experiences on an app, and you're choosing not to maybe, get on that bulletin board, but you're reading them for sure. Whatever form it's going to take, it's a really helpful thing.
Well, thank you so much, Sharon. This has been incredibly rich, and I really appreciate your contribution to our summit. And I think it's I remember in the early days of the neuroscience research, like a lot of people, I was saying, well, duh, yeah, this stuff works. Okay, we've known that for a long time. But it is an interesting time to be alive with all these different things coming together now, and lots of different languages. And as you said, the Buddha said that people need to study the teachings in their own vernacular, right? And so part of our modern vernacular is the brain science and so forth. So it does seem to be an exciting time to be alive. But I'm also grateful that we have access to people like yourself who really offer the classic kind of training, and that we can have that as a baseline and then see how we can enlarge upon that. So wonderful. Thank you so much for being part of the summit.
Thank you.
And encourage people to check out SharonSalzberg.com and Sharon's latest book, Real Life, The Journey from Isolation to Openness and Freedom. That sounds like a pretty good deal. Thank you very much, Sharon. Be well.
Thanks, too.